May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
A few years ago, I was at a restaurant with my family, and as I walked to my table past the door to the kitchen, I was stopped by one of the cooks. I was dressed in my clericals, and he asked me what my clergy collar was all about. It's amazing how a little question like that, which can seem so easy, can throw you for a loop. I never found out what this man's religious background was, but it quickly became clear to me that he had no familiarity with the Christian faith. I started out by saying, well, the collar meant that I am ordained. After a few awkward moments of blank stare, I said, well, the history of the clerical collar is, and I launched into a history, more blank stare. And then finally I said, it means I'm a preacher, which seemed to register. But then we got into a discussion of how some Christian pastors wear them and others don't. By the time I got back to my table and sat down, I wondered whether I had done any good or if I had just confused the man even more. And beyond that, and more importantly, how had I represented my faith? In our gospel reading for this morning, Jesus asks the disciples, and again to each of us this morning, who do you say that I am? That is the fundamental question for our lives as Christians. What do we say to others about who Jesus is through our words and through our actions? But even more basic than that, how does our answer to that question of who Jesus is make a difference in our lives? How does it make our lives different than they otherwise would be? Is Jesus just someone who lived long ago, a teacher, a prophet, a wise person? Is Jesus just someone who we teach our children about so that they can grow up to be, quote, good people? Or is Jesus more than that? Is Jesus someone who is living and who we can have a relationship with in our lives today? Is he someone who we can follow? How we answer that question for ourselves is one thing, but we know that other people will be asking that question about us as well. It's like the man who stopped me in the restaurant. He said to himself, I see that you are a Christian, but what does that really mean? This time of year when students are returning back to school, I have sympathy for students who have to return from summer vacation and endure the peppering of questions from their teachers to try and see what they remembered from last year. Now that our kids are at home, I get to see that more than I used to. Yesterday, I took Benjamin, my oldest son, to Scouts, and the Scout leader was doing that same thing. He was launching into questions about the Scout motto and all of the things that he wanted to make sure that they remembered from last year and other years. And the first questions, of course, are the easy ones, and the students are eager to jump at those. But those are just the setup for the hard ones, and when the teacher asks those, or the Scout leader, that you can see, I could see yesterday the Scouts quiet down for those quite a bit and begin to stare at the ground, hoping that somebody else will jump in. Jesus is like that in today's reading. He's gathered the disciples, his students, together. And the first questions are the softballs. Who do people say that I am? Well, the disciples are eager to jump at those questions. They've all been in the marketplaces. They've all been out in public. They know what people have been saying. Well, some people say, Jesus, that you are Elijah or Jeremiah or a prophet or John the Baptist. But then it's all just a setup for the question that Jesus gives next. Okay, that's fine. Who do you say that I am? At this, you can imagine the disciples getting quiet, their faces turning red, their palms sweaty, looking down at the ground, hoping that someone, Peter, he always jumps in there. Sure enough, he does, and he gets the answer right. You are the Messiah, the living Lord, the one who we can follow. That word, you, makes all the difference. Who do you say that I am? Talking about Jesus as an idea is far different than talking about Jesus as someone who I have a relationship with, who has made a difference in my life, who I make decisions in light of his life. It's the difference between having a concept about God and having a relationship with God. Even in these strange times when so many things are being done differently, we think of this as a kickoff time of year. Students are returning back to classes in whatever form that might take, or other activities like Scouts. And at this time of year, this kickoff time of year, maybe it's an especially good time to ask that question of ourselves again. Who do I say that Jesus is in my life? And what does that mean for my life, my commitments, my call? Then comes the real challenge. If we answer that question as Jesus is something more than just a teacher who lived once upon a time long ago, but someone who we can really be in relationship with and follow, then comes the question, will you take up your cross and follow me? Jesus is constantly faced with the temptation to avoid the reality of the cross, to spend his life trying to gain the approval of others, to do what people want him to do, to say what people want him to say, maybe to gain political power, control, wealth. But Jesus knows that that is not his mission. That is not his call. His call is rooted in something else. It's rooted in service. It's rooted in forming the reconciled community, the healed community in God's love. We all have calls in our own lives, whether it's the call of career, the call of family, the call of service, any number of things. And these calls are important, and they are unique to each one of us. Paul talks in our epistle reading for today about all the unique and varied types of calls, none more or less important. But what is common to us as Christians is that all of our calls are lived in light of the challenge to take up our cross and follow Jesus, who we are in relationship with. In other words, our lives are shaped by the pattern of Jesus' life. Our lives are cross-shaped. We all like to have some kind of control in our lives, and Jesus must have wanted that as well. Yet, like Jesus, we too have a sense that we may be guided along a path that we would not have otherwise chosen. We cannot fully know what the full impact or implications of going down one path versus the other will be. Sometimes the path that we know that we feel God is calling us to is the rocky one, the more difficult one, and we're tempted to go down the easier road. Going down that harder path may seem strange to others. They may wonder what we're doing. We feel the tension between the human and the divine decisions. I'll always remember the struggle that I felt several years ago when I decided to go from full-time work to part-time work as a priest, a career that I had only ever known at that point. I had been ordained for 10 years, and I was starting a new vocation, one that I felt equally called to as I had at the time when I started down the road of being a priest, a new vocation as an electrical engineer. And that was something I never would have imagined feeling called to at that point in my life. And yet, as I lived into that new call, I began to understand in a new way that although as a priest I had been given the wonderful privilege of building up the community and administering the sacraments, my new life would be no less sacramental. My new work would be no less holy, because it was lived at that point in my life as Jesus' call to me, the way that I was being called to follow him at that point. It taught me that there are always unexpected twists and turns as we seek to follow Jesus. And people may not always understand our decisions, and yet he gives us the courage and the strength to follow all the way. There's always a degree of uncertainty as we wrestle and struggle with those questions. But we can trust that Jesus is walking with us as we strive to be faithful. And if we do seek to follow him and take up our cross, we can count on constantly experiencing this pull within us, this tension between the human and the divine. Should I take this class or that one? Should I take this job or that one? Should I move here or there? Should I serve in this way or that way? These decisions, we all know, are messy and complicated, and they're never as simple as a clear black and white. I should do this or that. At least sometimes perhaps they are clearly revealed that way, but I think if you would agree, if you're like me, that's not your experience, that they are much more complicated than that. I don't know about you, but I get uncomfortable when I hear people talking about those sorts of decisions as things that they are supposed to do, as if God is some cosmic grade giver giving us an A for making the right choice and an F for the wrong one. The decisions we make about our lives are so much more mysterious, and God's hand operating through it is so much more unclear oftentimes. And oftentimes it's only in retrospect that we may feel like that decision that at the time felt like a complete failure was in God's mysterious way working all things to the good for us and for others. Who do you say that I am? That is the question Jesus asks us again this morning. If we say that he is the Messiah, as Peter does, then it will involve following. It will involve a life of discipleship. It will mean a life lived in the murkiness between the human and the divine. It will mean living into what Paul says in Romans 12, one of my favorite verses. Therefore, sisters and brothers, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. It will mean a life of unexpected twists and turns. And it will be a life filled with so much meaning beyond what we could ever imagine. As we walk with the one who walks with us every day. Amen.